We'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. Thank you very much for attending. I'd like to lay out a little bit of format here. If you have questions, feel free to use the chat bar throughout the webinar. We will do our best to answer questions as we go through the webinar, but if we cannot get to all the questions, we will respond to the questions via email after the webinar is over. The webinar can also be viewed by going to our Nexus CAN website, which is nexuscann.com/webinar. So with that, I would like to begin the webinar. Okay, first we'd like to talk about an overview of the construction process. There's some different things to consider when you're selecting your construction site. One of them is site selection. Another one is compliance, build requirements, construction, infrastructure, physical build out, and then it's finished with project completion. So Nexus has some processes that we follow ourselves, okay? And this would be when you call in and you start to work with Nexus, this is kind of the way our system works. First, we go through a design process. After that, it goes to a proposal approval. So we will design the overall greenhouses. We will then send you a proposal, which you will look at closely and determine, is this going to work for you? After that, once it's approved, we go to the engineered plan stage. Engineered plans are where you commission our engineers. Our engineers will do the physical drawing of the plans, and those then you can submit to building departments, and again you will approve those plans, and eventually they come back and we go to production. Once production is done, then delivery. Okay, site selection. So there's some things to consider in site selection. One, and this is very important, you want to have a pro-local government. So basically, you want to be in an area where the municipalities want cannabis. And there's a lot of very positive towards cannabis cultivation, and then there's several don't want that. So basically, does the county permit legal growing? And is the approval process streamlined and easy and completable?
Most people think about at the state level, and if they say you're okay at the state level, they just automatically assume they're okay at the county level. But for example, Colorado, who was the first to pass recreational, Colorado only lost 23 of its 64 counties to produce commercial cannabis for cultivation.
Correct. So once again, you just want to try and select a site that has a pro-cannabis mindset with the local municipality. Also in site selection, there's some other things to consider. We kind of labeled this section utilities and infrastructure, but a number of different components go into this aspect of site selection. So when we say amount of sunlight really just comes down to how sunny is the location. If you have an opportunity to build in Arizona or Colorado or somewhere else that gets 300 plus days of sunlight a year, and California has some of those as well, or if your other option might be to build along a coastline or up in Seattle or somewhere where it rains a lot and it's cloudy a lot, it would make sense to go ahead and choose an area that gets a lot of sunlight. So a lot of times you can't really decide, it may not be up to you where you're going to build. You might already have your site or you have your license in a specific area. So you might be locked into your site. But if it's available to you as an option, always select a sunnier site.
Next would be utilities. It's important that you have a source of electricity to the site. Most growers want three-phase 277 480 volt power. However, you certainly can do this with single phase. Most everyone's going to need a generator too as a backup source of power for when the grid's not reliable. Natural gas is preferred, but there are people doing this on propane in remote locations. Operational costs vary depending on location to location. Typically speaking, propane is a little bit more costly than natural gas, but that's not always the case. And then lastly, water to the site. Water is very important for cultivation and could be one of the most important elements in choosing a site.
That's absolutely true. And I know you've mentioned several times, is there a basic rule of thumb that you use for how much water you're looking for at a site?
Not that you'll go through this amount of water, but it's good to plan for between a third and a half a gallon per square foot of cultivation per day. Most likely you'll never touch that amount of water, but there certainly are places like, say, for example, Arizona, where you'll cool 24 hours a day and you'll require water for cooling. And then you'll also have a higher irrigation demand, too, in these hotter locations. So water is very important for just not only for growing, but for cleaning and cooling.
Yeah, and then under utilities, I know there's also similar rules of thumb for electricity, and I know we've based on a 10,000 square foot module, we say that we need about 300 kVA transformer for that size?
That's correct. 300 kVA, because kVA works in whether you're in single phase or you're in three-phase 480. So ideally you would be in three-phase 277 480, but you could certainly get 300 kVA worth of power using single-phase power. It's just not ideal.
Gotcha. Okay, so excise tax. Excise tax is basically the tax that the local government is going to charge you to grow in their area. So that can vary a lot. We've seen excise taxes in the neighborhood of $15 per square foot per year.
Yes, and some people on a growing basis too. Sometimes it's on a per pound 15%. So it can vary quite a bit, just depending on where you're at, which state you're in.
And that makes sense to consider those things when you're selecting your site. So proximity to highways and distribution. Not a whole lot of explanation is probably needed on this topic. It's just a lot easier to distribute if you are near highway infrastructure versus way out in the boondocks and you have to deliver everything, say, 50 or 100 miles to the closest city or more.
And just recall, this is a labor-intensive practice, cultivating cannabis. So it's important to be able to get your workers there when you need them.
Yeah. Okay, climate. We kind of covered climate a little bit when we were talking about sunlight, but there are other aspects that go into climate, such as amount of rainfall, what kind of wind you have in that area, or even snow loads can figure in.
That's correct, and it is possible to build these facilities remotely if you want to be away from the general population, but you got to take into consideration all these elements that we're talking about here. And sure, the land price might be cheaper, but your operational costs might be higher ultimately.
Okay, moving along. Structure selection based on site. So design considerations. So here's where we're going to get into load reviews. So load reviews really cover the different things that are going to happen to your greenhouse structure based upon where you put it. So it has to do with everything from wind loads, snow loads, seismic loads. So these are loading aspects that are going to vary from site to site. And when you're selecting your structure, it's important to consider what you're going to have to withstand with the design of your structure. If you're in a very heavy snow load area, you're probably not going to want to choose a structure that has, say, a double poly roll plastic roof. You're going to want a structure with probably an A-frame and a hard, rigid covering that can really stand up to the snow loads. Same thing goes with wind, and same thing goes with the seismic levels.
That's correct. And then also when we talk about these are live loads, wind, snow, and seismic, we have to think about our dead loads too. And so a cheaper structure, say for example, bent tubing for a high tunnel structure, kind of a ground-to-ground, that's probably not going to be able to pass any kind of code for supporting all the different dead loads that are inside the greenhouses, such as lights and heating and cooling equipment, and then also the shade system. So when we're talking about load reviews, we're talking about both live and dead loads, and the live being the wind, the snow, and the seismic, which really requires an engineered structure in order to take on that kind of forces.
Great. Thanks for bringing that up. Greenhouse engineers, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll tighten the truss spacing to manage the varied wind and snow amounts. So what that means is instead of having a 12-foot truss, you may have a 10-foot truss, or you may have an 8-foot truss to withstand the different loads that may be necessary.
That's correct. Column spacing, that's correct.
Okay, building mandates. So depending upon the geographical conditions, the local government will require a variety of building mandates. So these are things that the government's going to require of your build based upon where it is you're building, whatever they've decided is important. And it can be a number of different things. So well, first and foremost, you're going to have your state license. So that permits you to legally grow cannabis. Conditional use or other municipal permits, so that's called your CUP or your conditional use permit. This is basically to comply with the city or local municipality's zoning ordinances. Odor mitigation. That's another one that is not needed everywhere. If you're out in the country, a lot of times nobody cares about the odor. But if you're in a city environment or you have a close proximity to your neighbors, odor mitigation is oftentimes required. Security also oftentimes required. Everyone is going to want security to some level. Some people will accomplish that with a chain link fence and barbed wire. Other people feel it's necessary to use a metal sidewall, which is very, very common, and that obviously raises your security level significantly. So security is important. Sometimes it's required. Sometimes it's just a matter of how secure do you want to be. Environmental impact. So environmental impact can be everything from waste disposal and chemical disposal. Are you going to recycle your water? Are you going to recondition it? There's a lot of factors that come into your environmental impact, but it's just something to keep in mind that's oftentimes going to be mandated by your local building departments. Utilities. Specific municipalities may have utility usage requirements. So a lot of places will say, we're only going to allow 25 watts per square foot, for instance, or we're only going to allow so much energy usage for your lights, for instance. So there's certain requirements that sometimes the local municipalities will require.
So moving on, when it comes to building a structure, there's two different types of structures you can have: a permanent structure and a non-permanent structure. A permanent structure is going to be much more strenuous to go through than it will be to build a non-permanent structure, but most cannabis growers are finding themselves in this category because of the nature of the crop.
So a non-permanent structure oftentimes is much simpler to build, but is really dependent upon where you're located. So you would need to be in an area typically that's zoned agricultural. But if that's the case, then there's not as stringent of requirements. So your plans, for instance, can be stamped plans, or they can be non-engineered stamped plans. Your foundation work can be very basic. It doesn't necessarily have to pass a lot of design criteria. It just needs to make sure the structure is going to stay put and withstand the loads. General contractors, they're usually nice to have guys who know what they're doing, especially when you're building a greenhouse with greenhouse experience. But oftentimes, sometimes even homeowners will build these themselves, or project owners will take on the GC aspect of this job. Also, when it comes down to inspections, there's not necessarily inspections needed when you're in a non-permitted area. So that makes it a little bit simpler. The permitted side of it.
Now that's going to be more so the case that you'd probably be looking at, because if you're going to have other people working inside this facility other than yourself, you're probably going to be having a zone that has a different occupancy, and just because it's cannabis, it's going to be looked at with a very, very strict criteria.
That's more common than not.
More common than not. This will be a commercially inspected structure, which means it'll require stamped engineered plans to meet the building department's requirements. Oftentimes, owners will involve an architect in the overall layout of the facility. They'll probably get a civil engineer involved, and mechanical engineer, mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineer involved. Sometimes the licensed general contractor will take on this responsibility instead of the architect, but sometimes they work in conjunction. You'll have to have a foundation design, which will coordinate work between the geotechnical engineer and Nexus's engineers. And then finally, you'll have to pass an inspection. So there's quite a few more steps of a permitted structure. However, most guys are finding that that's the category they fall into.
Yep, absolutely. So here we break it down just a little bit further, just to make sure we simplified it and kind of covered the topic. So in remote or agricultural areas, a local building permit may not be necessary or required. Plans, customers will receive engineered plans, but no stamp is necessarily needed for the building department. Nexus designs all of our structures to meet the IBC International Building Codes, regardless of permitting. General contractors, possibly could be a customer built, inspection not needed by local government.
However, for a permanent structure, which is likely to take place if you're in an urban or suburban area, you'll need specific building processes which will need to be checked off by your local government. Actually inspected structure will require the local building department to see that it meets building codes, meaning that it has to be stamped by engineers, and that typically takes us here at Nexus for the structural stamps between 3 and 4 weeks. And then, of course, it'll have to meet the building department approval, which could take any amount of time, depending on how familiar the building department is with a cannabis greenhouse. Architects will probably be involved when you go to the building department. You'll probably want to involve an architect to coordinate the different jobs that need to take place. The first job that needs to take place is you'll have to have a soil test done on the site. They typically come out and bore a number of different holes to measure the soil's compaction. Then you'll work with a Nexus engineer to provide you reaction loads for all the different columns. Then you'll take those reaction loads along with a soil test, and the geotechnical engineer will design the foundation for the structure. After all this has been done, the architect will typically lay in the foundation design on top of the Nexus structural designs and create his own, what I call kind of an architectural layout, and he'll submit that to the city along with your help.
Okay, foundations. There's quite a bit to cover under foundations. A lot of people seem to get a little hung up on this part, but they're really not too complicated. Foundation could be a number of different components. Concrete slabs are definitely the most common in a high-end cannabis greenhouse. The reason is it increases your cleanliness, so much easier to keep a foundation clean. There's less surface area versus like a rock substrate or any type of ground cloth cover. So the less surface area equates to less pathogens, less places for mold spores, less places for bugs to populate. So really do recommend going with the concrete slab, although it is not the only way to go. Another thing that a concrete slab does is it reduces your humidity, and that's just because it's easier to keep it clean, it's easier to keep it dry. It's generally built with floor drains, and it just helps you to keep your moisture under control. Also, it's easier to work on. You know, there's better transport of equipment and crop as you're moving it through your greenhouse. So concrete slabs have a higher cost, yet they do contain substantial benefits, and they are the recommended substrate for your greenhouse.
They're much easier to put in during the initial installation of the greenhouse versus a retrofit. However, I will say this, Dave, there are cases where concrete slabs become kind of a challenge to do for the foundation. You might have to build an additional foundation outside of your floor because of the high wind speeds or different reactions that you might have taking place on the column. Say you live in a very high seismic area like Southern California. Well, oftentimes what the builder will do at that point is he'll put a column and a case on, but he'll still pour a slab around the case on and for the whole floor, so you have a concrete floor. So it's a combination of both.
And actually, you bring up great points going into our next slide. So Paul talked a little bit about this. I'm just going to jump right into reaction loads. So reaction loads are basic loads against the columns. So it's how hard does the wind blow? How hard does the snow blow against it? What kind of stresses does that create where the column is anchored into your foundation? So Nexus will actually provide calculations for that in conjunction with your soil engineer's test will then go to create your foundation design. But we can build our structures to meet any specific loads. We can put these structures anywhere in the United States, and we can meet any load requirements that are out there. The foundation is usually cement. It can be other surfaces such as rocks or gravel or a ground cover cloth. But as I mentioned in the last slide, we do recommend concrete. It's much easier to work with. So when you're building a foundation, you've got your columns on top of it, and then your trusses go on top of that. The whole structure is built off of your columns. So there's different ways to attach your columns to your foundation. Okay, one of them is caissons. So caissons are columns set in cement. So a hole is drilled into the ground. The column is inserted into the hole. Cement is poured around it. The column is leveled and plumbed before it dries, and then it's just set right in the cement. A footer is when a foundation is poured around the perimeter to whatever depth it needs to go, and then the columns are typically attached to that footer. The footer may be 8 inches wide, maybe 6 inches wide, depends on what the loading requires. The columns are then attached to the top of that with a base plate, and you just go holes through that base plate, and you use some sort of attaching mechanism like an expansion bolt to attach the foot plate to the foundation. Lastly, we have column stubs. Column stubs are very similar to columns, only they're very short. You set the column stub into the caisson, and then you pour the concrete around it, and you set the column on top of the stub. The stub is swedged. It's a little bit smaller than the column diameter, and the column slides right over top of it. And there's a little bit of adjustment there that's capable with that setup. So it's a little easier to set than columns directly into cement. And then lastly, you have your final inspection of all of these things. Make sure they were done properly.
And in this picture here, you can see a good example of a footer that's built around the perimeter of the structure. It's maybe a foot wide, and who knows, it may be 2 feet deep.
Okay, that pretty much covers foundations. Building inspection. So we have building department. So the building department has some specific steps they go through. They're going to vary a little bit from place to place. We're not saying that this is every type of inspection you're going to have in your area, but just be aware that the building department has specific steps. Typically, they're going to start with your plan approval. So once you have our engineered plans drawn, you're going to take those into your building department. They're going to look at them and they're going to say, okay, this looks great, no worries, or hey, we have to change this, and this. Maybe we have to add some doors, or maybe you need to add some fire suppression or whatever they require. And then we get into structural inspections typically, a foundation inspection typically, and mechanical, electrical, and plumbing inspections. And once you have your various inspections throughout your process, those are all going to culminate in your final building inspection, which is where you obtain your certificate of occupancy, otherwise known as your CO. The actual inspections may vary depending upon the building department in your state.
Okay, so next you want to make sure you can choose a contractor that suits your needs. Greenhouse itself is basically a large erector set. A skilled builder can pretty much build it just based off the instructions that they come with. However, it's to your benefit to have a metal building contractor work on your project because you might be more familiar with the style of construction. The architect typically will coordinate the different engineers that are required for the project. So oftentimes if you go to a local architect, he'll have a group of people he likes to work with that cover the soils, the foundation, and the civil work, and he's accustomed to taking all their different inputs and putting it together into what they call a design review package for the building department. Nexus is just one group that works within that whole subset of groups that work with the architect, and we provide the structural information for him to build his design review package out of. Now, the architect's also going to be familiar with different code compliances that he needs to know about, such as fire suppression, occupancy level, and ADA for handicap
accessibility, exactly.
And then a general contractor, he could do a lot of the same work as the architect. He can coordinate this work, but typically he works outside of the architect and he coordinates the different laborers on the project, the different tradesmen, exactly. And so, kind of one of the last steps is you'll have the MEP come in there and sign off on all the different pieces of equipment, such as the plumbing, the electrical, and then the gas lines.
Correct. So, our bottom note here, building experience with home or office does not translate to greenhouse success. There is a lot to be said for having someone who knows the tricks of the trade for building greenhouses. There's certain little things such as the light deprivation system and how the flashing goes on. Well, an experienced greenhouse builder may want to put the flashing on the trusses before he lifts the trusses into place, for instance. Things like that save time. That's what you're going to get with someone who knows how to build greenhouses. But, it's not rocket science. Any good builder would be able to erect these things. It's just you're going to have a shorter build time with a good greenhouse builder.
That's correct. And then also just getting to the building department with an architect that's familiar with cannabis structures will also be to your advantage, because the architect oftentimes will do the layout of the warehouse, and he'll be familiar with the types of equipment and the types of processes that take place in your head house processing building.
Very, very good point.
So next I'd like to move on to Buildout Steps. We'll kind of summarize it here, and it doesn't necessarily always go in this order, but it pretty much adheres to this pattern from what we've seen. So the very first thing you would want is site preparation, and oftentimes that means, for folks that are in rural locations, bringing in utilities. If you already have utilities, that's great. You can kind of you can put them underground and move them to where the site is and have them out of the way while you're doing your grading work.
I'd like to just point out one thing here, and that is utilities can be extremely expensive to bring to a site if you don't already have them. So one of the things we probably should have mentioned in site selection is you really want to try to have a site that already has significant or enough electricity to that site. It's very costly to bring it a couple miles down the road.
Yeah, plan for expansion. And then also just to mention a little bit about the grading. That could be expensive too. When you're choosing a proper site, you want to make sure you kind of choose one that doesn't have too many hills, because the greenhouses like to be on a 1% slope, give or take. And to move all that dirt, especially if it's in a very rocky environment, can be costly and could actually take a lot of time out of your project schedule. So, this goes, site preparation and site selection kind of go hand in hand. Moving on, though, foundation and flooring. So, as we discussed here, you could either do a footer, you could pour caissons, or you could pour a slab, and that's going to depend on your budget as well as the loadings. Next, setting the columns. Now, this is kind of a picture of a facility that's already had the columns, trusses, and purlin set, but setting up the columns goes pretty quick, and then the next step would be to set the trusses, and then lastly the purlins and the gutters.
Let me interject here real quick. So I want to point out, and this picture is a great spot to do it, when you look at these trusses, you see that these are our trusses. They come pre-assembled. Our trusses are welded one-piece construction. So they're stronger because they're welded together, but also you don't have to bolt together all the tiny pieces of each individual truss. They come pre-assembled, ready to be set. This increases your build, or decreases actually, your build time significantly compared to having assembled all your trusses on site.
Saving you quite a bit in labor, ultimately.
Ultimately, labor costs.
So once you got your purlins and your wall framing up, then you can start putting your coverings up. And just depending on the time of the year that you're doing this, you might put your roof up first if it's the winter time, or if it's spring and you're getting rained on, or you might put up your wall coverings first and the curtains first if it's the summertime and you want to be out of the heat. By not putting the roof on there, you'll be able to work inside there for a little bit longer until you bring power to all the equipment.
So just real basic remedial stuff. Make sure we're all on the same page. Your coverings are the physical coverings that go over the greenhouse. So it could be corrugated plastic. It could be twin wall polycarbonate. It could even be roll plastic, double layer roll plastic. The curtains then are actually your shade curtains or your light deprivation curtains, which would go inside under the truss.
Mm-hmm. And then once you have your coverings up, you can start framing around your different pieces of equipment, such as your fans and your intake vents. So then the next thing would be to install the equipment, which includes your heating and your cooling. Then once all your equipment's in place, you can bring in your electricians, your plumbers, and your plumbers to connect for your heaters and for your water connections, your pad wall, or maybe you just have some hose bibs throughout the facility, things like that for cleaning things, and also for irrigation. So once all that's said, then you have your final inspection of all the connections and the structure itself.
All right, project timeline. So this is a basic timeline. It can vary a little bit. We're looking at 1 to 2 weeks for design work, so we call it a proposal design. That's where we meet with you, we talk to you, we determine what it is that you would like to design and what type of structure is needed for your location, what your specific requirements may be. So typically the proposal design takes a week to 2 weeks, and it's just us figuring out what you want. Then we've got about 3 to 4 weeks for the engineer drawings. We've touched on that, but basically you commission our engineer drawings. They draw the plans. That's what you need to take to your building department for your approval. It's also what you need for bidding your project as well as building your project. So that's usually a 3 to 4 week process. Then we're looking at 4 to 6 weeks for production and delivery. So once your plans have been approved by the building department, you come back to us and say, okay, we're ready to go to production. So that's great. We love to hear that. As soon as we go to production, it could be anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. If it's a significantly large project, then it might take 6 to 8 weeks or even longer. It really just depends on the size of your facility, but 4 to 6 weeks is pretty normal. Now the 7 to 8 weeks for construction, again, that's completely dependent upon the size of your structure, who you're using for your GC to put the structure up, and any other variables can figure in there, such as weather and everything else. So bottom caveat here is just contractor schedule can vary due to size of the project, location, and scope of equipment. But this is a basic project timeline.
Yeah, and that's correct. And they vary, like Dave said here. But they could take anywhere from, I'd say, about 3.5 months from the start of a project, getting it designed to completion, all the way up to 5 months, depending on the scale of the project.
Okay.
Next, we'd just kind of like to summarize a little bit about Nexus here and give you a little bit of background information. We're celebrating our 50th year in the industry as a leading manufacturer for greenhouses, both horticultural, institutional, commercial. It's headquartered in Colorado, where we have one of our manufacturing plants, but we also have a second manufacturing plant in Illinois. We have in-house professional engineering team to help assist with all these different needs that we just outlined in this presentation here. We're licensed engineers in 49 states. We have 2 manufacturing plants, as I mentioned, and we have over 1 million square feet of cannabis projects in 12 states, and we're counting.
Correct. Yeah, we're building more cannabis projects all the time. So we do have several going up in just about every state that we can be building them in. Okay, so for more information, or if you would like to view our future webinars, the next one's going to be on cannabis greenhouse growing operations. You can sign up at www.nexuscan, that's nexuscan.com/webinars. Plus, you can click on links there for past webinars, which will take you to our YouTube channel and show you all of our past webinars. For a free greenhouse consultation, please give us a call at 720-330-0830 or email us at info@nexuscan.com. That's info@nexuscan.com.